They sat a measured arm's length apart at a low, polished table. 5 empty glasses caught the studio lights, glimmering like unanswered questions. Van Lean's smile was made for television. Meghan's was built for defense. Table for 5 promised honesty. Tonight it was closer to ignition. The set was styled to feel like an upgraded living room. Matte charcoal walls, a moss green rug, books arranged in planned disorder. Behind them, a cursive neon sign glowed, "Pull up a chair." The 5th seat stayed empty, part of the show's concept. The other 4 formed a clean square around a small table dotted with coasters and half-melted glasses of still water. Van Lean began the introductions in a smooth baritone, every syllable perfectly placed. 2 cultural critics, a young filmmaker, and Meghan Markle. At her name, the air in the room tightened, the way a theater stills just before the curtain rises. Meghan entered calmly, already aware of every camera's gaze. Cream blazer, silk blouse, hair in soft waves, expression collected. She gave a polite smile to the panel, then to Van. It didn't waver, but it didn't invite warmth either. "Meghan, thank you for joining us," Van began. "You've said you feel most misunderstood when others define you. So tonight, define yourself." She didn't pause. "Mother, wife, producer, someone building things that last?" "Builder," Van nodded. "Let's build, then." He turned toward the filmmaker. "You had a question." The filmmaker cleared her throat. "Many admire your philanthropy. Others call it curated. How do you respond?" Meghan folded her hands, controlled, composed. "Curated suggests pretense. I prefer focus. If you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing well." Van's eyebrow rose. "Focus can also mean control." "It can," she agreed. "Or it can be how women protect their work from being drowned out by noise." A light murmur passed around the table. Van let the quiet stretch just long enough to make it feel intentional. "Let's explore that," he said. "Noise. Since leaving the UK, you've said you stepped back to find yourself. Yet the spotlight followed. Do you ever worry the message has become you?" Meghan's smile tightened. "When a woman owns her story, people call it narcissism. It's an old trick. Or branding," one critic added. "Very effective branding." Her gaze didn't shift from Van. "Would you rather I hand my story back to the people who profit from twisting it?" Van steadied a wobbling coaster beneath his glass. "That's the cultural tension," he said softly. "Intention versus impact. You aim for empowerment, but some say it exhausts people. Too much messaging, too much marketing." "I can't control those who confuse purpose with promotion," she replied. "I can only control the work." "The work," Van echoed. "Documentaries, podcasts, children's projects, yes, all real. But public life is a two-way street. You speak. The world speaks back, often without listening." He smiled faintly. "Touché." The older critic leaned forward. "Do you miss anything about royal life?" "Not the system, the tradition, the continuity." Meghan's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't miss mistaking ritual for meaning." Van leaned in, his tone still warm but edged. "So meaning now looks like Malibu sunlight and creative meetings?" "Meaning looks like freedom," she said evenly. "Where my kids can grow up with choices beyond ceremony." There was no live audience, yet the air pulsed with a silent ooh that a crowd might have offered. Van didn't smile. He shimmered, sensing tension. "Let's talk privilege and pressure." "You've had both." "Which speaks louder at 3 a.m.? "Pressure," she answered. "Privilege only matters by how you use it. And how have you used it?" "To build platforms for voices never handed a microphone." Van rotated his glass slowly. "Critics would argue those microphones still mostly point at you." "Critics are paid to argue," she replied smoothly. "True," he said, friendly but pressing. "But culture keeps receipts." The temperature around the table shifted, subtle but felt. The filmmaker jumped in gently. "How's Harry handling the noise?" "He's a good man who loves his family," she said softly. "We're happy. It might sound dull, but peace often does." Van smiled with appreciation. "Happiness as resistance. I can respect that." Then, steering back, "Still, some say responding to tabloids just feeds them." "I'm allowed to correct falsehoods," she said. "Silence is grace until it becomes complicity." And where's that line? When lies hurt people who didn't choose this life. "If it's just me, I let it go." Van nodded slowly, then shifting tone. "Let's widen the lens. You exist at the intersection of race, royalty, celebrity, and the American story. That's combustible fuel. Do you feel pressure to be more than personal, to be political? Existing as myself has always been political to someone, she replied. I won't take purity tests to make that easier. The older critic scribbled notes. The younger watched her like studying movement. The empty fifth chair began to feel symbolic, a seat for public expectation. Van clasped his hands, leaned back, then forward again, his tone measured but sharp. I'll be honest. People from my background have a radar for performance. We hear the pain, we hear the hope, but we also sense when something feels packaged. Meghan's lips tightened. And do you apply that radar evenly? Or only to women who refuse to shrink? Van grinned slightly. That's a fair strike. I'm not striking, she said calmly. I'm asking if the critique is about content or comfort. He tapped the table once. We'll find out. The stage light blinked amber. 2 minutes to break. Van ignored it briefly. Last question before the pause. If the UK called tomorrow, no tabloids, no palace politics, just a request to rejoin the charitable work there, would you pick up? Meghan inhaled slowly. I answer every call that serves people, not crowns. Clever, he said with a hint of warmth. But crowns fund causes. So do streaming platforms, she countered. And sometimes those checks build schools. Amber turned red. We'll pause here, Van said. When we return, commerce, conscience, and the price of being believed. He held her gaze a moment, an unspoken challenge. She met it, equally steady. The director called cut. Ice clinked. Someone coughed. A coaster still rocked unevenly. The air between them, polite, polished, felt like a fuse waiting for fire. When cameras returned, the light seemed harsher, or maybe the tension made them feel that way. Meghan adjusted her blazer slightly, preparing for round 2. Van leaned in, tone measured. Before the break, you spoke about freedom, owning your story. Let's test that, the filmmaker gave a nervous laugh. Meghan didn't. She tilted her chin. Go ahead, Van smiled. Not cruelly, just knowingly. You've built your image on empowerment, authenticity, breaking barriers. But some think that empowerment began only when the cameras returned, that maybe struggle became strategy. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crew. Meghan's lips parted slightly, not shocked, just controlled. So I should apologize for learning from experience? Not at all, Van said. But people wonder, is this the real you, or the version refined for Netflix? The tension cracked like ice. Meghan leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. You're asking if I owe proof of authenticity. If that's the standard, everyone fails. Authenticity isn't performance, it's consistency. Consistency cuts both ways, Van replied. When you say you ignore the press but then respond, or avoid attention but do global interviews, people see contradiction. Meghan drew a slow breath. No, that's participation. There's a difference between being silent and being silenced. I'm not playing the victim. I'm reclaiming my story, the older critic murmured. That's fair. Van pressed on. Some admire you deeply, but others think you've made pain your brand, that every project needs a confession. The line hit hard. Even the camera operator hesitated. Meghan blinked once. So if I speak about pain, I exploit it. If I don't, I hide it. There's no winning, is there? Van shrugged. You chose the seat that comes with the spotlight. Her tone dropped, cool and firm. And what seat are you in, Van? The one that decides which women's voices count, and which are too polished to trust. His smile tightened. I ask what people want answered. That's my job. No, Meghan said softly. Your job is to tell the truth, not repeat what sells. The room stilled. Even background hum faded. Van's control slipped for a moment. That's rich from someone who's profited from her own truth. The private audience shifted uncomfortably. The silence buzzed. I don't monetize my truth, Meghan said evenly. I share it. The fact that people listen says more about their hunger for honesty than about me. Van exhaled, leaning back. You see how that sounds, though? You've become the face of control, turning pain into power. But control can isolate. Do you ever feel lonely in all that perfection? For the first time, something genuine flickered. Fatigue, maybe. Then it was gone. I feel human, she said. Humans aren't perfect. They're just judged as if they should be. Van nodded. Maybe it's not judgment, it's accountability. Meghan straightened. I've taken more accountability for my choices than most. I walked away from a palace for peace. How much more do you need? The filmmaker whispered. Wow. Van smiled slightly, sensing the spark. Peace, he echoed. People love it until it threatens their comfort. Meghan's eyes sharpened. Exactly. You just proved my point. The critic tried to cut in, but the rhythm between them had locked into something magnetic. Debate disguised as dialogue. Van leaned back. People wanted to see you struggle quietly, the private survivor. Instead, you went global. Oprah, documentaries, podcasts. That's power, but also spectacle. Would you say that to a man? Meghan asked flatly. Because last I checked, when men show vulnerability, it's called courage. When women do, it's called performance. The temperature in the studio dipped again. Van hesitated, just long enough for the cameras to capture the shift. Dominance giving way to defense. Fair, he said at last, his tone steady. But when you have this kind of influence, don't. You owe transparency? Meghan leaned in, resting her elbows lightly on the table. Her voice came out calm, sharp as glass. Transparency without empathy is just interrogation, and I don't owe anyone my pain to prove my sincerity. Van opened his mouth, then stopped. There was something about her stillness, not anger but certainty, that disarmed him. The director's cue light flashed again, rap segment. But no one moved. For a moment, the show had slipped its script. It felt real. Meghan's hand rested gently on the table, steady and sure. Van looked down at it, then back at her. In his eyes, respect, mixed with challenge. This, he said quietly, is why people watch this show. She gave a faint smile, one that never reached her eyes. And it's why I rarely do them anymore. Cut, the stage manager called. Next topic, the price of truth in media. But everyone knew the real headline had already written itself. When the red light blinked again, Meghan's posture was flawless, calm, centered, composed, but the air had changed. The tension from before hadn't dissolved, it had deepened. Van leaned forward, elbows on the table, gaze fixed on her. Let's talk about control, he said. You've built an empire around it. Image, narrative, brand. But do you ever worry that in controlling the story, you've stopped being part of it? Meghan tilted her head slightly, voice even, but edged. If you're asking whether I live for the public, the answer's no. Control isn't manipulation, it's survival. Survival, Van echoed. That's a strong word. You're one of the most privileged people alive. 2 homes, private security, streaming deals. Survival doesn't usually come with a Netflix contract. The remark landed like a soft punch. The critics shifted in their seats. Even the camera operator glanced up. Meghan blinked once, then smiled faintly, a smile that forgave nothing. You think privilege cancels pain? You think success erases scars? That's lazy thinking, Van. He gave a small, dismissive laugh. I'm just saying, there's a difference between struggle and scrutiny. And there's a difference, she returned, between commentary and cruelty. The room went quiet. Even the older critic's pen froze mid-note. Van's tone softened, though the edge remained. You say that, but people see every headline, every interview, and they start to wonder, are you still fighting the system or feeding it? Meghan's voice dropped lower. Maybe the system never stopped feeding on people like me. That line cracked the silence. Van paused, then smiled again, the kind of smile that meant he was about to push harder. All right, he said. Let's be honest. You've spoken about racism in the monarchy, mental health, media lies. But some say you've told that story so often, it's hard to see where pain ends and PR begins. The young filmmaker looked uneasy. Meghan's jaw tightened. I didn't come here to defend my trauma, she said slowly. I came here for a conversation. This is a conversation, Van said, raising a hand. I'm just asking the questions people want answered. No, she replied sharply. You're asking the questions that get clicks. The audience, small but attentive, shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The sound echoed like a crack. Van leaned closer. So you admit this is about publicity? Meghan met his stare. What I admit, she said, is that I expected a journalist, not a provocateur hiding behind critique. That word hit him. His smile faltered. Provocateur? You're not having a dialogue, Van, she continued. You're collecting sound bites. You're turning empathy into entertainment. That's not journalism, it's theater. For the first time, Van's composure slipped. You don't get to come here and rewrite the rules of the table, he said, voice rising. Then maybe your table needs new rules, Meghan replied. Silence, heavy and alive. Van let out a short laugh. Wow. So, no one's allowed to challenge Meghan Markle? Royal immunity still applies? She turned her head toward him slowly. The grace was there, but steel underneath. Don't confuse immunity with boundaries, she said. You can challenge me. You just can't disrespect me. The air thinned. The filmmaker's eyes darted nervously. Van gestured with a smirk. You've had a global platform, Oprah, Netflix, Spotify, and now when someone asks hard questions, it's suddenly disrespect? Meghan's tone stayed calm, but firm. Tough questions are fair. But when the tone assumes bad faith before I speak, that's not tough. That's toxic. Van raised his brows. So now I'm toxic. I didn't say that, she said evenly. But maybe the culture you thrive in rewards toxicity more than truth. The producer waved behind the cameras. Wrap soon. But the exchange had locked in. You know what I think? Van said, leaning closer, voice coated in mock sincerity. I think you're addicted to victimhood. You've built a career out of being wronged. It's the only story you know how to tell. The entire room froze. Even the director lowered his headset. Meghan didn't move. Her expression turned to glass. Excuse me? You heard me, Van said. Every time you're on camera, it's about what the world did to you. Maybe people just want to see who you are without the sympathy. Her voice turned quiet, cold enough to cut. Who I am doesn't need your permission. For the first time that night, Van had no comeback. She leaned forward slightly, her words sharp but steady. You want authenticity? Here it is. I'm tired. Tired of men mistaking empathy for weakness, tired of people calling honesty self-pity because it makes them uncomfortable, and tired of pretending this kind of exchange is progress. The cameras kept rolling, but no one breathed. Van swallowed, his confidence fading. So, what are you saying? I'm saying, she replied softly, if this is what a modern table looks like, maybe I don't need a seat at it. The director's hand hovered over the cut button. We're still live, whispered the filmmaker. Meghan didn't care. Respect, she said, her voice calm again, isn't a privilege, Van. It's a choice. He stared at her, realizing too late the power had shifted. When the show cut to its final commercial, the studio fell silent, air like glass. Every sound cracked through it. Van sat frozen, the light from the rig reflected in his eyes. Meghan, once composed, now looked like someone holding back a storm she refused to release. When the cameras blinked red again, Van's voice had changed, colder now, stripped of charm. Welcome back, he said, staring into the lens. Before the break, Meghan said respect is a choice. Let's test that. People say you demand respect but rarely return it. That when challenged, you play the victim. Are they wrong? A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Even the sound engineer froze. Meghan didn't flinch. If defending myself from unfair attacks is playing the victim, she said, then maybe the definition needs to change. Van gave a dry laugh. That's convenient. But let's be honest. You've built an entire image around being silenced, and yet you talk more than anyone alive. Her expression hardened. You know what's interesting, Van? How quick people are to question a woman's voice the second she starts using it. A murmur spread through the small audience. Van noticed, and it irritated him. He leaned in. You talk about empowerment and truth, but somehow the story always comes back to you. Isn't that convenient? Meghan exhaled slowly. You call it convenient. I call it lived experience. Maybe that says more about how you see women than how I live. Or maybe, Van countered, you've learned to weaponize sympathy. The words hit like a slap. The older critic muttered, "Oh man," under his breath. Meghan blinked once, slow and deliberate. You should think very carefully before using that word. Why? Van challenged. You've made a brand out of being misunderstood. No, she said, voice razor sharp. I've made a life out of surviving people like you. The room went still. Van laughed weakly. See? That's exactly it. You twist everything into persecution. And you twist truth into spectacle, she shot back. You don't want honesty. You want a headline. He smirked. That's rich, coming from you. Meghan pushed her chair back. The scraping sound sliced through the silence. I came here in good faith, she said. But this isn't a conversation. It's performance. You're not listening, Van. You're performing. Van straightened, tense now. You can't come on my show and define what's authentic. And you, she said, rising, can't invite me and think I'll stay silent while you talk down to me. The crew moved nervously behind the cameras. Van forced a laugh. You're walking out because you can't handle hard questions. She looked down at him, calm. No, I'm walking out because you can't handle accountability. Accountability. For what? For confusing provocation with journalism, she said, unclipping her mic. For mistaking empathy as weakness. For thinking you can insult someone and call it truth. The mic hit the table with a thud that echoed across the set. The filmmaker tried to speak, but Meghan was already heading for the door. The small audience began to clap. One person, then another. Van turned sharply toward them. Don't clap. That's not courage. That's ego. The applause only grew louder. Meghan stopped halfway, turned back once. Ego, she said, is believing you can humiliate people and still call it journalism. Then she walked off, calm, unhurried, her heels striking like punctuation marks in a story that didn't need more words. Van sat staring at the empty chair. The realization hit. He'd pushed too far. He adjusted his jacket, forced a smile, looked to camera. Well, he said, forcing composure, that's one way to end a conversation. No one laughed. The camera panned to the table, the half-empty glasses, the coaster that still wouldn't sit flat, and the vacant chair where civility used to be. Cut the feed, Van muttered. The red light died, but the moment didn't. Because long after Meghan Markle walked out of that studio, the internet would replay that clip, the silence, the defiance, the walkout, and for once, the story didn't belong to the host. It belonged to the woman who refused to let anyone rewrite her truth. A quiet studio, an empty chair, and the echo of a voice that wouldn't be silenced.